Hey everybody, Pastor Dan here. This week we're going to continue with the introduction to the Pentateuch. Last week we covered an introduction to the Bible, and so we're going to narrow down this week, narrowing in on the Pentateuch itself. So what is the Pentateuch? So the Pentateuch is actually the first 5 books of the Bible. It's known as the Pentateuch. Jews refer to it as the Torah. It is also known as the books of the law, the books of Moses, or the book of Moses, and also the law of Moses. So the Pentateuch actually means, in Greek, 5-part book, or the 5 scrolls, whereas Torah means the law. And so these are all ways that we can refer to the first 5 books of the Bible. The first 5 books of the Bible are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And these were all actually designed to be one book. Now, they were often separated. These large books were often separated into different scrolls because you could only fit so much on a scroll. And so often you'd have a separation of a very large book into multiple volumes. And so that's what you have here. You have a large book that is separated into 5 volumes, which is where we get the 5 scrolls, or the 5-part book, which we call the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is located at the very beginning of the Bible. So you see here on the chart, the law makes up the first 5 books of the Bible. And so it's an easy way to remember it. We're starting with the Pentateuch, the books of the law, which are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So what is the origin of the Pentateuch? We're going to really talk about that a lot tonight. So prior to having written documents, stories were passed through what is called the oral tradition. So oral tradition, as you see here, the definition says the stories, beliefs, etc., that a group of people share by telling stories and talking to each other. So here in this picture, we see Native Americans sitting around a fire and telling stories. This is how stories were passed, how history was passed, how knowledge was passed down from one generation to another before writing was invented. And you see here at the bottom, we do have writing that dates back to as far as 3500 BC. And so there may have been writings prior to the Pentateuch that people were drawing on. But a lot of this was still carried down through what we call oral tradition. The Pentateuch is also surrounded in controversy. The origins of the Pentateuch is one of the largest controversies that are debated by scholars, by biblical scholars, and there's many reasons for that. We'll talk a little bit about a few of those reasons. The few reasons I have listed here are, number 1, the date of the Exodus. Number 2, authorship, who actually wrote these books. And number 3, the date of those writings. So in regard to the Exodus, there's 2 commonly known dates that are thrown around for the date of the Exodus. Excuse me. The first of these is approximately 1446 BC, which is what we call the early date. And we do that because it's obviously earlier than the other date, which is the late date, which is supposed around 270 BC. So you can see here on the chart that everything on the right side lines up. So both the dating from biblical sources as well as from the archaeology are very in sync from 1050 on, where we have the first king of Israel. But prior to that, the archaeological record and what people suppose to be the archaeological record in the Bible don't necessarily line up with the dates that are put in the Bible itself. So if you were to take all the dates in the Bible and stack them on top of each other to create a timeline, you would find something like the early date timeline we see here. However, if you're simply looking at archaeology and not relying on the Bible itself, you would find something more like the late Exodus, which is down here on the bottom. And there's several things that you can make a case for both of these, for both the early date and the late date. And I think there's strong cases on both accounts. But there are some things that are unclear. For instance, we see Ramses here. We're not sure necessarily which Ramses is referred to in the Bible. And so that can create some confusion there. So whether we take the early date or the late date, it's not that the things that happen, the history that's documented within the Pentateuch, that isn't necessarily fought against, but it's rather the timetable in which these things occur. The other thing is who wrote I wrote who wrote Exodus. I meant here who wrote the Pentateuch and when. So Exodus would obviously be a part of that, but there is a lot of controversy actually around who wrote the Pentateuch. Hebrew tradition and mentions in the New Testament all placed Moses as the author of the Pentateuch. I think there was very well accepted tradition of Moses writing the Pentateuch. In fact, it's called his book. But there are some issues with Mosaic authorship. And a few of these issues we'll talk about here in just a minute. So there is some evidence here in these verses that are written below that refer to the fact that Moses is writing or inscribing or collecting this information, that God has asked him or told him to write things down. And so there is some evidence that Moses actually wrote, if not the whole book, at least a lot of it. So some of these issues that come up are, number one, first, Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy. Spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read it. But somebody else had to finish the book. The last chapter of the book is actually written by someone else about Moses' death. And so obviously Moses didn't write that part. There are also some late mentions in the books. So we talked about Ramses. So there's a mention in the book of the district of Ramses. Well, the district of Ramses didn't actually exist until several hundred years after the time of Moses. And so that's a late entry. And then third, Genesis 1 through 11 is written as a polemic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week when we get into Genesis. But most scholars believe that Genesis 1 through 11 doesn't quite fit, and that it was actually added at a later time, or at least changed sufficiently at a later time. And so we have several issues that occur here that make us question whether Moses is actually the author of the entire book or not. So there's some solutions to this dilemma that don't necessarily bring us a cause for concern. So Moses could have written most of it and only had a later Babylonic editor who kind of came in and cleaned up some of the things that were going on and just made them a little bit more clear and added some more detail, which is maybe where the district of Ramses came in. Maybe there was an editor that came in later and kind of pushed the audience of that time into understanding where Moses was and what they were doing. You also have Joshua. Joshua becomes an opportunity for this also. Joshua was Moses's helper, and he followed and went with Moses everywhere. In fact, he even stood with Moses before God at times. And so we could have Joshua as writing all these things down and collecting all this information. And Joshua would actually be a good fit for the person who is recording Moses' death. And so you could put Joshua with a Babylonic editor also. You could have all three. You could have Moses and Joshua and a Babylonic editor in play here. And personally, I think that probably makes the most sense. Again, you could have Moses with some miscellaneous writings that were around, and then a Babylonic editor who compiles all these things, who puts them all together into what we know as the Book of Moses. But there are some other options. There's some other controversy out there where other people think that there's just miscellaneous writings that were put together by an editor and then attributed to Moses. There's other people that think the entire thing was written during the Babylon exile by some priests that were there. And then probably the most popular of the controversial views is what we call JEDP. So this is a comprising of the book by 4 different authors that come at different time periods. So none of these is claimed to be Moses, but 4 different authors between the 10th century and the 6th century wrote pieces of material, and then a later editor put these all together to form what we have today. I think there's lots of flaws with this view, but it is a very popular view amongst those who don't believe that Moses is the author. So what is in the Pentateuch? So let's talk a little bit about the contents of the Pentateuch itself. So the Pentateuch is, there's a lot of different parts of the Pentateuch. A lot of it records history from the beginning of time until the end of Moses's time. And so in a lot of ways, it's historical, but it's not lumped in with the historical books for several reasons. The first is that it's foundational, so it sets the whole foundation for God's story. And we have to think to ourselves, should we think of Genesis 1:11 as literal history, or should we merely think of it as a polemic against Babylonic history and Mesopotamian history? Again, that's something that we'll cover next week. But these are the things that we have to think about. The Pentateuch also includes law. A large portion of the Pentateuch is law. It was designed for the Hebrews to really know who God was and how they should act in accordance in their relationship with God. And then we have to look at genre also, because it contains multiple kinds of genre. There's prose narrative or historical narrative, which is the third-person account of history. But historical narrative not only takes into account history itself, but it gives you the writer's viewpoint of that history. You also have poetry. This is the first recordings that we still have of Hebrew poetry. You have prophetic revelation, which foretells and exposits the meaning of covenant revelation, of things that happen that God reveals through his special revelation to Moses or to Joshua. We see these things happen in Scripture. And then we have law. So law itself is not uncommon during this period. You guys have probably all heard of Hammurabi's Code in school. And this goes back to the 18th century BC. Well, a large portion, like I mentioned above, is the Pentateuch is law. And so we have to understand why the Pentateuch was written. What is it that drove God to have somebody, Moses or not, write this down for the Hebrew people? And the Pentateuch is really a reminder. It's a written down permanent reminder to the Hebrews that they were chosen by God. They were chosen out of all the other people, all the other nations, to be God's chosen people. And so this is a way that he chose to communicate their purpose and his laws for maintaining their status as his chosen people. And so by following Yahweh's laws, the Israelites would be assured of blessing and of God's presence within their land. We also need to look at whether we should view the Pentateuch as historically reliable or not. So I'm going to look at three different schools of thought here about the historical reliability of the Pentateuch. The first is the Orthodox approach. The Orthodox approach is simply taking everything as literal. Like God supernaturally inspired every word, or at least every bit of content within the Pentateuch, and it should be taken as historically accurate. The second view is a historical archaeological approach. This actually says that the Pentateuch is very accurate, but there's some dating issues that need to be aligned with the archaeological data. And so I think that there's a lot of credence for this view. And part of that is because you're dealing with, again, historical. We just go back up here real quick. Oops. Sorry. We're dealing with historical narrative, right? And so the historical narrative does bring in a writer's bias. And so you see the point of view of the writer. And so there may be things that the writer gets incorrect, or maybe inflates for different reasons. And we can talk about that in the question time if you have questions about that. But I think there's a lot of credence here with the historical archaeological approach. The third approach is the historical reconstructionist approach. And so the people that take this approach really most often deny the divine inspiration of Scripture and look at simply as literature. And in this case, they point to the fact that some parts of the literature is inaccurate. You know, it was written by pre-scientific ancient historians, and therefore we should use other extra biblical documents to carry as much, if not more, weight along with the archaeological record to put together a historical idea of what happened during the time of the Pentateuch. So I think there's a little bit of credence here. The fact that the people that wrote the Old Testament were pre-scientific people, and they didn't understand how things happened, and so they had an ancient worldview. But I think it's important for us to try to understand their worldview and not dismiss something just because they didn't understand it. And so again, I think this middle road, this via media, which is the historical archaeological approach, makes a lot of sense. I think that we can take the Bible for what it is. God is communicating to us through a human being, and a sinful, flawed human being at that. And so just because God inspires a human being to write something doesn't mean that every word that the writer writes is going to be perfect. They may get numbers wrong. They may inflate numbers for other reasons to scare their enemies. And again, so this is things that we can talk about during the question and answer time, but I really want you to understand whether or not we can trust the Pentateuch to be historically reliable. And so I think largely we can trust the Pentateuch to be historically accurate. But always keeping in mind that our foundation is God telling his story. So as long as we keep that in mind, I think that we can take the Pentateuch to be very reliable.